Hey guys, Dr. Gabrielle Fondero here, RP Nutrition Coach, and I am going to be talking to you today about the relationship between the gut microbiome and our diet. This is a really expansive area, and so I'm going to be focusing primarily on macronutrients with a little blurb on some supplements as well. There's so much data in this area that it's really hard to fit this into, even a couple hours. I just want to give you a snapshot on what we're fairly confident about in the literature thus far. In rodents, we've been able to establish an extremely strong correlation between a high-fat diet, obesity, sedentary lifestyle, and dysbiosis. Now, if you remember from my original video on kind of introducing the microbiome, dysbiosis is an umbrella term. There's no single profile of dysbiosis, and there's no single cure to dysbiosis. But dysbiosis refers to a reduction in diversity. So we're either losing out on species richness, how many species are there, species evenness, how evenly they're represented. So if we're looking at dysbiosis, we're looking at a gut that may not be very diverse. That means that it could have too few beneficial bacteria or too many pathogenic bacteria, or a combination of both. In humans, this has been reproduced, and we've reproduced this in rodents as well. So in humans, we also see that there's a strong correlation between a high-fat diet, obesity, sedentary lifestyle, and also type 2 diabetes and dysbiosis. And dysbiosis has been associated with a number of other diseases like inflammatory bowel diseases and colorectal cancer. I'm often asked, what is a high-fat diet? People want to know, what is it that we're feeding the rodents, or what are people eating when we're looking at these microbiome studies? In research, generally speaking, a high-fat diet is anywhere from 40 to 60% calories from fat. Usually those come along with a hefty dose of saturated fat as well. And they often are also including refined carbohydrates. Perhaps sucrose is the carbohydrate. And protein content may range from about 10 to 25% protein. And so those diets, those high-fat diets, are intended to replicate a westernized standard American diet that's high in fat, high in saturated fat, and high in refined carbohydrates. Now, sometimes people think that they have to cut carbs to lose weight, and they even are surprised when I stress the benefits of complex carbohydrates and taking in fiber, fruits, and vegetables, especially in light of the recent popularity of things like the ketogenic diet or the carnivore diet. Now, when we think that, when we associate carbs with things like breakfast pastries and pizza and fries, those foods are not just carbohydrate foods. Those foods are highly palatable. They contain carbohydrates, fats, usually some sodium in there as well. And so those foods are highly palatable. We want to eat more of them. It's very easy to overeat on those foods. They're very calorically dense. And so, yes, they can contribute to weight gain if they're eaten in excess, but so can everything else. So carbs themselves, just like any other macronutrient, are not the enemy. That's not the single causative factor of obesity. It's the combination of refined carbohydrates, fats, and sodium and things that make food taste really good that we want to eat more of them, and we overeat, and that's what actually contributes to obesity. I want to stress that I don't vilify fats. Fats are an essential macronutrient. We need to include them in the diet. It's just key that we're taking in the right amount of fats and the right types. So fats can be either saturated or unsaturated. Generally speaking, saturated fats are usually from animal origin, although coconut oil is one exception, and they're going to be solid at room temperature. Unsaturated fats are usually from plant origin, and they are going to be liquid at room temperature. But there are exceptions to that too, like fatty fish has plenty of unsaturated fats, so it's very beneficial to health. You want to eat a few servings of fatty fish a week. So there are obviously exceptions to those rules. Of those unsaturated fats, we can have mono or polyunsaturated fats. Monounsaturated, when we talk about saturation, we're talking about basically how many hydrogens are present for each of the carbons that are in that molecule. So a saturated fat, all of those carbons have a full set of hydrogens, so that's why they're nice and stick straight, and they're that's solid at room temp. Whereas when we're looking at unsaturated fats, they don't have a full set of hydrogens, and so some of those carbons have to form double bonds with each other. So monounsaturated has one double bond, polyunsaturated has two or more double bonds. Of those polyunsaturated fats, we have essential fatty acids. So we have omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. The omega-3 and omega-6, that just refers to where those double bonds are taking place. But we have a specific omega-6 fatty acid that's essential and a specific omega-3 fatty acid that's essential. So we need to get those from the diet because we can't make them in the body, hence the name essential. Recently, polyunsaturated fats have sort of been coming under fire because people consider them to be inflammatory. Well, in fact, omega-3 fatty acids are anti-inflammatory and omega-6 fatty acids can be pro-inflammatory. But just like we want to have a balance of beneficial and pathogenic bacteria in the gut, we want to have a balance of omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. Just so happens that in the standard American diet, we usually are getting plenty of omega-6 fatty acids and not enough of those omega-3 fatty acids. So if you are thinking about making some changes to your diet, you could switch out some of the omega-6 fatty acids for omega-3s, basically replace some of your avocado and peanut butter with fatty fish. So fats are very important. However, we know that from both human and animal studies, even in ketogenic diet studies in humans, a diet of greater than 40% calories from fat is generally associated with reduced microbial diversity in the gut. And that's generally considered to be a bad thing. So why is that? Well, it could be because these diets are generally low in fiber. That's probably one of the major reasons because, like I mentioned in my intro video, a lot of these bacteria, they want to ferment fibers. And so if we don't have those fibers present in the gut, well, just like any animal can't subsist off nothing. And so those bacteria, those beneficial bacteria, will die off. These diets have also been associated with increased intestinal permeability and increased circulating endotoxin levels. This could perhaps be due to reduced levels of butyrate because the bacteria ferment some of those fibers to short-chain fatty acids, one of which is butyrate. So if we don't have the fiber, if we don't have those bacteria, we can't produce as much butyrate, then that may actually reduce levels of tight junction proteins and lead to increased intestinal permeability, which then allows more of that endotoxin to leak out into circulation, which can cause that low-grade inflammation or metabolic endotoxemia. So there have been some cool studies done looking at the effects of fat specifically on the microbiome. Not many of them have really shown that the type of fat makes that much of a difference, honestly. We have seen that perhaps omega-3s could be protective against increased intestinal permeability and inflammation. But we just haven't looked specifically at fats in the microbiome. It's really been, a high-fat diet, but in concert with the refined carbohydrates and things like that. But I did find this study that I've pointed out on the slide pretty interesting. They took two sets of mice. They fed one set of mice a diet of that included a lard-based fat, so their fats were lard, and another group of mice whose fats came from fish oils. They found that the mice who were eating the diet with fish oil fats ate less and gained less weight over time. That's not super groundbreaking that if you eat less, you gain less weight, but it's interesting to see that they had different food preferences. So the mice that were in the lard-based diet actually ate more. The next step was really interesting. In the next step, they took the gut microbiome, the gut bacteria from each set of those mice and transplanted it into a new set of mice. So that means that now our groups are one group of mice has bacteria from that's from a lard-based diet, and another group of mice has bacteria from a fish oil-based diet. They fed them both the lard-based diet and found that the fish oil results were replicated even though they had a lard-based diet. So that means that the mice who had the fish oil microbiome ate less and gained less weight than the mice who had the lard-based microbiome, even though they were both eating a lard-based diet. So that shows that not only does your diet influence your microbiome, but your microbiome can influence perhaps your dietary practices and propensity for overeating and for weight gain. Now, although the Human Microbiome Project is done, there is a citizen science sort of crowdsourced project going on called the American Gut Project. And the American Gut Project allows individuals to send in fecal samples, which they then analyze, depersonalize, so there's no information that can identify that person, and they add them to this sort of ongoing pool of data. And they make publications from this data based on statistical analyses of various observations, like what's the correlation between antibiotics and gut diversity, or what's the correlation between specific dietary intakes and gut diversity. And they found that the number one predictor of microbial diversity was actually plant diversity in the diet. So if you're eating, a few dozen varieties of plants in your diet, you're probably going to have greater gut diversity than someone who's eating less than that. Plants don't have to be just fruits and vegetables. It's anything that's a plant. So whole grains are included in there as well. And so that's really just supportive of what we already suspected based on previous literature looking at both human and animal studies, that complex carbohydrates and fiber are supportive of a diverse microbiome. They can help prevent dysbiosis, if we want to look at it, in that way. Carbohydrates can come in the form of a complex carbohydrate. They can also be in the form of simple carbohydrates. So examples of complex carbohydrates would be starchy things like whole grains, and a simple carbohydrate, one that's really easy, would be table sugar. So obviously we want to prioritize complex carbohydrates in the diet because we want to give our bacteria plenty of fiber to ferment. Now, not all fibers are easily fermentable. So generally speaking, soluble fibers, those that get soft and mushy when you add them to water, those are going to be readily fermentable. Whereas insoluble fibers that don't change when you put them into water, those aren't going to be as readily fermentable. We do need both. You need to have insoluble fiber because that helps to produce bulk in the stool. It can, because of the friction that it produces when it's kind of scraping along the walls of the intestines, it can enhance mucus production. And then our soluble fiber helps to absorb excess cholesterol, also can contribute to bulk, and then obviously is fermented by the bacteria. And they ferment these to short-chain fatty acids, acetate, propionate, and butyrate. And butyrate, like I mentioned in my previous video, this is sort of the superstar of the short-chain fatty acid world. Butyrate is associated with improved tight junction formation, appetite regulation, even pH regulation. So butyrate is definitely a huge benefit. Now, in early studies, there were some concerns that the production of these short-chain fatty acids could be problematic because we're increasing the energy harvesting and energy content, really, of the diet. So when people do things like count net carbs, they may not count fiber because fiber is not readily digestible by humans, so we can't extract the energy that's stored in fiber. But these bacteria can ferment that fiber, produce short-chain fatty acids, and those we actually can absorb. And so those bacteria, and their capacity to increase energy harvesting from the diet, that could actually increase our caloric intake by anywhere from 6 to about 15%. So as a general rule, I usually say, if you're in a cutting phase, it's probably prudent to just count all of the carbs because you really can't be too sure whether you're actually getting, nothing from that fiber. You're probably getting something, especially if you have a lot of these beneficial butyrate producers. Now that can be a double-edged sword. Obviously, if you already, if you're trying to lose weight, well, it's just another hurdle if you have a microbiome that is good at harvesting energy from the diet. Whereas if you're a person who's trying to gain weight, you may want more of those. Or if you're a person who is, in a developing country and you have low food availability, it actually is of great benefit to have those butyrate producers. Now, one thing that I hear from people frequently is that, if they have too much fiber or, they feel better when they're eating like a really low fiber diet or a ketogenic diet or the carnivore diet because, fiber is problematic to them. There are some forms of fiber that, because they're so readily fermentable, and not all fibers are fermented to short-chain fatty acids, we can also produce gas, obviously. Most of us are familiar with that. Like, we have methane producers in there as well. They produce gas, and if the gas doesn't pass easily, that accumulates in the gut, and that can really mess with gastric motility, gastric emptying, and it's just very uncomfortable. It leads to bloating and things like that. So those are, we classify them as FODMAPs. So these fermentable fibers, these FODMAPs, can actually exacerbate symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome. So if you find that after you eat perhaps onions or garlic or a variety of fruits and vegetables, because there are many on this list, many of them contain FODMAPs, and then you experience gas and bloating, it's not necessarily that it's the fiber or the carbohydrates themselves it's not all fiber, it's not all carbohydrates that are causing those issues. It's sort of like saying red lights cause traffic jams. That could be a contributing factor, but we can't say that all red lights cause traffic jams. Plenty of other things do too. So that being said, it's not a bad idea to follow a low FODMAP protocol for a couple of weeks. You can find lists of low FODMAP foods on the internet fairly easily, and reintroduce a food one at a time. And then you can sort of, as an N of one, test out what fibers may be causing you to experience gas and bloating and things like that. But it's not necessarily that those are, causing a health problem. It's just that you have bacteria present that are producing methane, and that's accumulating. Certainly uncomfortable though, and, worth looking into to find some relief. People often also ask about artificial sweeteners when it comes to carbohydrates. Artificial sweeteners come in a variety of forms. So we have some that are chemically produced. We have some that are naturally occurring. So the ones that people are usually familiar with would be things like saccharin, aspartame, acesulfame, sucralose. We also have stevia. There are sugar alcohols like erythritol, maltitol, xylitol, and usually the chemically produced sugar alcohols are sort of demonized, while people think that, the naturally occurring ones or the sugar alcohols are superior. Well, all food is chemicals, and so we can't demonize something just because it's a chemical. Classically, the earlier studies done on artificial sweeteners were using super physiological doses, so huge doses in rodents that were not equivalent to anything that a human could reasonably ingest. So we have to sort of, those had their day, and we know now that those are not reliable resources. There have been some studies done on humans and that actually looked at effects in the microbiome. And for the most part, they really don't have an effect, especially when we're looking at aspartame and acesulfame. They really don't do anything to the microbiome. Saccharin, when ingested at the acceptable daily intake level, may have an influence on the microbiome in some people based on one study. But that really is not great evidence to say that, we should be removing saccharin from our diet. And then sucralose has been shown, once again, just in a limited number of studies, just in humans and in rodents, to perhaps influence insulin sensitivity in a small portion of participants. When you look at the data as a whole, it looks like perhaps about 1% of people will experience transient changes in either the microbial profile or insulin sensitivity during the time that they're taking these artificial sweeteners in at various doses that may range from 15% of the acceptable daily intake range all the way up to 100% of the acceptable daily intake range. But when you look at the big picture for, replacing sugar sweetened beverages with non-nutritive sweeteners, there's actually a benefit to in terms of body mass index, weight control, weight loss, because you're reducing caloric intake. So, all things in moderation. If you are undergoing a weight loss diet of some sort, one of the easiest ways to reduce your caloric intake is by removing or replacing those sugar sweetened beverages. And as long as you're using these artificial sweeteners in moderation, there's no evidence to say that they're going to have lasting damaging effects on the microbiome. We just don't have the evidence that supports that notion. So protein has become the big kahuna lately. It's one of those macronutrients that people think that, they really just can't get enough of, and you can't have too much of. And there's certainly a ceiling to that. That being said, we've learned a lot about the benefits of high protein diets. And we know that there's not going to be, in healthy individuals, there's not going to be damage to the kidneys. We know that it's the least obesogenic macronutrient. We know that we can have intakes of up to, 4+ grams per kilogram of body weight and actually see improvements in body composition. So protein has a host of health benefits, from increasing muscle growth to maintaining bone mineral density. It's a super awesome macronutrient. That being said, we have to look at the effects on the microbiome. Of course, we don't have as much data on protein sources as we do looking at things like fat and carbohydrates, because those have sort of been, the quote unquote like problem children of the macronutrient world, whereas protein seems to be like a pretty okay guy. High protein diets and what we consider to be a high protein diet is really not entirely agreed upon, but what we know from looking at microbiome studies, maybe 10 to 25% calories from protein. It's a really big range, but we know that increasing protein content of the diet can increase bacteria that metabolize amino acids. No surprise, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So that's okay if those bacteria stick with just metabolizing amino acids from the diet, but that's actually not the case. And so in mice, it's been shown that a high protein diet, especially when low in fiber, like a high protein or high protein / ketogenic diet, which may not always be high in protein, caveats. But when we increase the protein content, we increase mucin degraders. And so those guys are actually, can actually decrease the mucus layer of that covers our intestinal cells. But they don't always do that. So there are actually beneficial mucin degraders, and then there are problematic mucin degraders. So it gets even more nuanced than that. So take that with a grain of salt, that, we know that we increase numbers of mucin degraders. That doesn't necessarily mean that we are thinning the mucus layer of the intestines. But when you are, simultaneously increasing protein and reducing fiber intake, well, now you may run into problems, because now you have fewer numbers of those beneficial bacteria and perhaps more of those mucin degraders, and now you could be actually contributing to a thinning mucus layer. So if you're going to have a high protein diet, it's just prudent to also make sure that that's high in fiber as well. Different protein sources will also have different fatty acid content and perhaps even different fiber content. If we're looking at protein sources of plant origin, in most cases, plant proteins are also coming with a dose of complex carbohydrates and fibers. For example, if you look at things like beans and lentils, they have some protein and also plenty of complex carbohydrates. And then if you're looking at protein sources of animal origin, The fatty acid content can vary if we're looking at something like fish, which is going to be higher in omega-3 fatty acids, versus something like red meat is going to be much higher in saturated fatty acids. So these could be part of the reason why we see different effects for muscle growth, for appetite regulation, for hedonic eating, or eating when we're not hungry but it just tastes good. So there could certainly be influences on the microbiome as well. Now, gluten is a protein of plant origin. It's one that's really been under fire lately. A lot of people are on a gluten-free diet, think they may have gluten sensitivity. Now, there are certainly diagnosable gluten allergies. And so if you do have a diagnosed gluten allergy, you should be avoiding gluten. Whether or not gluten sensitivity exists is still under question. There are other compounds found in wheat that could actually be contributing to an inflammatory response in the gut, things that are not gluten. So we don't know for sure whether it's actually gluten that's causing inflammation related to the intake of wheat products. We have seen in longitudinal studies that adopting a gluten-free diet does not enhance weight loss, and in fact is associated with weight gain over time. Most gluten-free foods are actually higher in refined carbohydrates, they lack fiber, and so there's actually a decrease in bifidobacteria. It's one really beneficial fiber fermenter. You might be familiar with it from like probiotic supplements. And so we see that's reduced often in a gluten-free diet as well. So there's really no justification for just an everyday person to go on a gluten-free diet in order to try and lose weight, because there's no evidence to show that it will actually help with that. So there have been a couple interesting studies that both in humans and in rodents looking at the effects of different sources of protein on things like hypertrophy and weight gain. One of the studies that I have highlighted on this slide used a rodent model to look at the obesogenic potential for various forms of protein. So as you can see, we have both plant and animal-based proteins here. Now, in all of these diets, minus cod, the animals actually ate the same amount. Now, in the cod-based diet, animals actually ate a little bit less. They all had fairly similar macronutrient distributions, except that the beef diet had a higher percentage of fat. But as you can see, when we look at the range of obesogenic potential, pork actually caused the animals to gain the greatest amount of fat mass versus soy, in which animals gained the least amount of fat mass. We'll take cod out of there because they ate less, but interestingly, beef, even though it had the highest proportion of fat, was not the most obesogenic option. Now, this is really interesting information, but it's just one study, and the researchers aren't really certain why this happened, given that animals ate about the same and had, roughly the same caloric intake. But it could be due to differences in branched chain amino acid content, differences in fatty acid profile. We really just aren't sure yet. It's just an interesting piece of data. Now, they didn't look at the microbiome in this study. It was just something that caught my eye and really, got to the idea that it's not just, even though, body weight, when we're controlling body weight, obviously calories in versus calories out, that's key. But when we look at, nutrient quality and we're looking at what food choices we're making, we know that what we are using to fill those calories can certainly have an impact on our appetite, on our propensity for hedonic eating, and for our potential for both lean mass and fat mass gains. So it's just something to think about. Now, there are other theories for ways that the microbiome might interact with dietary proteins and increase risk of cardiovascular disease or be of benefit to our health. Now, once again, we want to make sure that we're not making extrapolations based on single studies. For example, a while back, there was a study that showed that we had increased production of TMAO, which is a marker for cardiovascular disease risk, from eating red meat. But we can see the same thing from eating fish. And we know that eating fish is not associated with cardiovascular disease risk. So, we just have to be careful about what type of extrapolations we're making. And it really looks like, as long as you are eating sufficient fiber and keeping your dietary fat intake in check, you can safely eat a high protein diet, and it's probably going to be of benefit to you. Now, you might be thinking, this is way too extreme, and it's not translational, because people don't have these dietary extremes where they're just eating, 100% of their protein from cod or 100% of their fats from red meat. But then, actually, no, people are doing that, because we have things like the carnivore diet, or the snake diet, or sometimes people even do ketogenic diets to that extreme. So yes, people are actually doing really extreme diets, and they're really pushing the limits on fiber deficiency and sort of ignoring some of the more practical and pragmatic information and advice that we've known for a long time. A lot of people knock the dietary guidelines for Americans, and the problem isn't necessarily that there's a problem with the guidelines. The problem really is that only about 50% of Americans are actually following them, and only about 20% of Americans are meeting the physical activity recommendations. So it's very difficult to say that something isn't working when people aren't using it properly. If you look at the dietary guidelines, they actually have done away with the old-fashioned food pyramid. And what we have now is the My Plate guidelines that helps you determine how you should split up your plate. About half your plate should be fruits and vegetables, and then about a quarter of grains or starch, and another quarter of lean meat. Throw some servings of dairy in there, and some some healthy fats, and some discretionary sweets and calories, because treats are normal. That's totally fine. We need to include those in the diet. They just recommend that we maintain energy balance, and that we limit things like sodium and refined sugar and trans fats. And so these recommendations that I make may not be groundbreaking, but they're practical and they're evidence-based. So there's no best diet. Obviously, it has to be something that you can stick to. But if you're looking for a diet that ranks very highly, really outranks other diets in terms of reducing cardiovascular disease risk, helping to maintain healthy body weight, really high nutrient density, you might want to look into the Mediterranean diet. It's no surprise that it's based on, whole grains, complex carbohydrates, fruits, vegetables, daily physical activity, and then limiting things like red meat and sweets. Those are just practical, pragmatic recommendations, and it looks like those practices together increase and support numbers of beneficial bacteria and decrease our risk of things like type 2 diabetes, obesity, and that low-grade inflammation. Now, once you've established the foundation of a nutrient-dense, energy-balanced diet, you might want to start looking into supplements. It should not go the other way around. I have a lot of people who are really interested in what supplements they can take to improve their gut health. Well, clearly, one of the best things that you can do to maintain gut health is to eat fiber and maintain body weight. And we'll look into exercise in the next video, but that's beneficial too. And so supplements don't really have a huge effect. That being said, I completely understand if you're interested, and I also want to let you know that there are a lot of things that are actually not beneficial at all, or even harmful, that are sold under the guise of being beneficial for gut bacteria. So if you take a look at this slide, you can see that we have a chart here where we can rate things from a scale of expensive to inexpensive and effective to ineffective. And ideally, we want our supplements to be both fairly inexpensive and also effective. One of the best things, if you wanted to take a supplement, if you had a hard time getting enough dietary fiber, you could take a fiber supplement. We've seen that supplementing with inulin, for example, can actually improve appetite regulation. And that's just one of many benefits. But there you go. That's something that's really evidence-based. Taking fiber of some sort, usually fermentable, that's going to be an inexpensive and effective way of supporting gut health, because now you're feeding those beneficial bacteria. We would consider this to be prebiotic, whereas a probiotic is actually bacteria themselves. Prebiotic feeds beneficial bacteria. Then if we get into the range of inexpensive but not necessarily effective because we don't really have enough information, that would be something like whey and coffee, because both of these have just really limited numbers of studies showing that they might be bifidogenic. That means they increase levels of bifidobacteria, and those are beneficial. So, okay, not too expensive. You could try those if you wanted to, and like, whey is really beneficial for a host of other reasons, and coffee is coffee, so why wouldn't you want to include that? It's awesome. But then moving towards we're not really sure if it's effective and it's kind of expensive, looking at antioxidant supplements themselves. Now, we know that there's benefits in ingesting compounds that have antioxidant properties, like anthocyanins and from colorful fruits and veggies, but taking them as a supplement, that really doesn't have a strong evidence base just yet in terms of, reducing perhaps like markers of inflammation and perhaps being protective against intestinal permeability. Now, probiotics have been shown to be effective for some things. They're a little bit expensive as well. So I'll get into that a little bit on the next slide as to whether or not you really want to make that investment. And then we have sort of the big four that are really popular right now. That's small intestinal bacterial overgrowth breath tests, IgG antibody testing for food sensitivities, collagen and glutamine supplements, and detoxes and cleanses. There's a fifth that I haven't even included on this list because it's such garbage. Electrodermal skin food sensitivity testing. That's like so far off of the chart of super expensive and complete hogwash. It doesn't even belong here. So let's dive a little bit deeper into some of these. Like I mentioned, coffee and whey and even casein perhaps could be bifidogenic. We know that whey and casein perhaps might be, because their protein being the least obesogenic macronutrient. And if we can prevent obesity, that's one of the best ways to maintain gut health. So those could be beneficial. Now, probiotics have been shown to be beneficial for reducing symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome and inflammatory bowel disease in terms of instances of diarrhea and then just general gastric distress. They may also help maintain intestinal tight junction integrity, so to help prevent intestinal permeability, and they may also be protective of insulin sensitivity during a high-fat diet, and that's been shown in to a moderate extent in rodents and in humans. So they may be beneficial. But a couple recent studies have come out that were really well done and really invasive, because not only did they measure fecal samples, which is sort of what classically researchers have measured. They've measured fecal samples to determine that probiotics had enriched the gut. Well, in fact, it looks like everyone will shed probiotic bacteria equally, but not everyone will be enriched by those probiotic bacteria equally. So there are some individuals who are resistant and some who are permissive to probiotic supplementation. There's really no way to tell what you are because your feces will look the same either way. So there's no way of knowing whether you're actually being enriched by those probiotics. Also, there's no way to control where those probiotics are taking up residence. Ideally, we want them to end up in your large intestine where they can then, ferment those fibers and produce short-chain fatty acids and behave like they're supposed to. But they could end up in your small intestine, and that actually could lead to small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. It looks like the use of proton pump inhibitors like Prevacid and antacids and things, because that can change the pH of the duodenum, which is the part of the small intestine that's closest to the stomach, that actually could increase risk of of developing a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, because remember, acidity helps to control microbial growth. And if we reduce acidity, we get increased microbial growth. So if you're using one of those and taking a probiotic, it's just something to keep in mind that, you could be at risk for developing something like that. So, given the fact that you don't know where they're going to end up and you don't really know if you're going to be enriched, if you're not having any symptoms of IBS or IBD, you probably don't need to bother supplementing with those, because you don't have any issues to treat, and why would you want to spend money on that? So that's one thing to think about. Now, I used to recommend taking a probiotic during and or after a strain of antibiotics. But once again, this group did another really super awesome and invasive study, and they found that that taking probiotics after a strain of antibiotics actually delayed recolonization of or I should say reestablishment of the native biome. So people who were taking the antibiotics and then the probiotics, it took them months to get back to their normal biome, and they actually had reduced diversity taking those probiotics. So they had preferential representation of just the probiotic strains, and those sort of were out competing their own strains. Whereas the people who did just watch and wait, they just went back to what they were doing normally. Their guts went back to normal, and it was even better if they did an autologous fecal transplant. So they had a transplant of their own fecal matter from before they started the antibiotics, and that got them right back to normal. So what made these studies really awesome and invasive? Well, instead of just studying feces, they actually studied mucosal and luminal contents from stomach all the way to colon. So they actually sampled in humans more invasively than really any other study has. So they were actually able to look at what is going on in the intestinal tract. And that's how they were able to identify that fecal microbial profiles are actually significantly different from what we see along the length of the digestive tract. They were able to then replicate these findings in mice by actually transplanting feces from the humans into mice. So with studies like that, now we can really see a much greater picture of what's going on, and I would consider that to be more quality evidence than just looking at the feces of a person who's taking a probiotic. So that's my long spiel on probiotics. There's a lot of conflicting data in some cases, especially when it comes to things like weight management, probably are not going to be beneficial. If you do have symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome, if you're experiencing gastric upset, they may be beneficial, but because they're producing, they can increase production of gas that actually could cause increased gassiness and increased bloating. So it's not going to be a panacea, for treating all ailments. So keep that in mind. And like I mentioned, with antioxidants, there was a study that was done in triathletes that showed that antioxidant supplementation with probiotics was better than probiotics alone for reducing markers of oxidative stress and inflammation. But again, just not a lot of data out there on actual antioxidant supplements. Now, if you're getting antioxidants naturally from your diet because you're eating a diet that's high in fruits and veggies, that's totally awesome. But this is just focusing on whether it's worth it to do supplementary things. Now, as far as the right side of the slide, you can see that we have some things here that are really expensive and not very beneficial as of yet, at least. Now, these SIBO breath tests, they can be good. Now, as you can see, the accuracy there ranges from 20 to 90%. So it depends on how they're administered, what substrate they use, how long they wait to test you, and there's no gold standard. There's no standardization for how this is administered. So that's really problematic because you could go to two different practitioners and get two different results. Now, it's not to say that SIBO doesn't exist. We can actually culture the duodenum and see that you have an overgrowth of bacteria there, but it's just, does the SIBO breath test actually give you an accurate positive or negative result? Not sure. Collagen and glutamine supplementation. Once again, this is an area that has received so much press and extremely limited evidence that it's beneficial for humans. I've seen a good bit of evidence that, in randomized control trials, people see like subjectively improved hair and skin. But when it comes to actual gut health and the claims that some practitioners make that collagen and glutamine will heal leaky gut, that is absolutely unfounded. Collagen is a poorly digested structural protein that's high in non-essential amino acids like glycine. So when you rate proteins, there's a variety of ways of rating them, but you can rate them basically by their bioavailability, so their digestibility, and then their amino acid content. And if we look at something like beef or whey or eggs, they're going to be near 1. So like, 0.97, 1 being the best. Collagen would be like a 0. So if you want to, spend your money on it because it's flavored and it tastes good or it's a binding agent or something, sure. But don't use it under the premise that it's going to do anything for gut health, because there's no human data that shows that it does anything that it claims to do. There might be some evidence that it's beneficial in animal models, but again, it's not looking at specifically, improving the expression of tight junction proteins, because I don't really know when they say heal leaky gut what exactly they mean, because that's not really a thing that you can do. So I digress. Don't bother with the collagen. And then glutamine is just another amino acid that intestinal cells like to use for energy, but it's really common in the diet. Taking extra isn't going to be of any extra benefit either. So once again, it's just one of those things that receives a lot of press because theoretically you'd think, oh, intestinal cells like to use glutamine for energy, give them more glutamine. They're already getting plenty, and they take what they need from the diet, and you get the rest. IgG antibody testing for food sensitivities. The American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology has actually issued a formal statement saying that these tests are not valid. They have not been validated to actually show that they do what they claim to do. The presence of an antibody does not indicate that you actually have an allergy to something. So allergies can be diagnosed, and allergies can be life-threatening. A food sensitivity may occur because something in that food is not easily digested by you. But it could be that, it's not necessarily a food sensitivity, but maybe it's just FODMAP and it's a fermentable fiber and you have a lot of bacteria that like to produce methane. So keep in mind that our digestive enzymes are made to break down macronutrients, not foods. So whether you're getting, protein from a steak versus an egg versus a piece of bread, the digestive enzymes will be acting on those proteins, not that food. So keep that in mind. Like, you wouldn't have an intolerance to just, or you can't develop an intolerance to just pizza. Like, that pizza contains a lot of different macronutrients. There could be something in that pizza that is causing you some gastric distress, but it's not like if you don't eat pizza for a while and then you start eating pizza again that you won't be able to digest that pizza. Because people tend to think that maybe their digestive enzymes have maladapted. That's not exactly how it works. So just keep that in mind. These IgG tests are really expensive and completely unsupported in the literature. So don't bother getting those. You can actually go get, go to an allergenist and get for example, a skin prick test. From that, you can determine if you have a food allergy. Finally, cleanses, detoxes. Again, not only are they not beneficial, but they may actually be dangerous. In some cases, cleanses and detoxes, because the supplement industry is regulated differently from foods. They can contain high levels of heavy metals. They can be hepatotoxic if they have really high levels of certain compounds that have been shown actually in some name brand supplements that I won't name, but they've got plenty of lawsuits and hepatotoxicity claims against them, can cause diarrhea, dehydration, and obviously, you know, those bacteria, they need to have time to hang out with your food. So if you have chronic diarrhea, that's not supportive of gut health. You have a liver, that's what handles the lipopolysaccharide or LPS, that endotoxin that comes from the gut. It handles it just fine. You have enzymes that actually detoxify that for you. So having a liver and having kidneys, you know, this one secret that doctors don't want you to know, that's all you need to be able to detox and cleanse. And then finally, the one that didn't even make this list, the electrodermal skin food sensitivity testing. That is literally like a magic 8-ball for looking for food sensitivities. They're measuring galvanic skin response, which is really just the conductivity of your skin based on how much sweat you're producing. Absolutely cannot determine if you have food sensitivities or allergies. Not only is it not supported in the literature, there's actually literature that shows that it does not do what it claims to do. So please don't be fooled. Don't spend exorbitant amounts of money on this stuff. The best results I've seen from people who have gastric upset are the individuals who don't add a bunch of supplements. Rather, they simplify things. They reduce their supplement use. They reduce their intake of FODMAPs, and you know, slowly introduce foods back in. So it's better to take that minimalist approach rather than trying to throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. You're going to spend a lot of money, and you probably will still end up, you know, wondering what the issue might have been in the end of it. So that's all for diet and the microbiome. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and join me next time when I talk about exercise in the microbiome.